Hi, I'm Jim Hanson. I'm going to talk about the resolution that you'll be debating, resolved global economic integration is on balance unjust. During this discussion, I'm going to talk about what the resolution means. What is economic integration? Second, I'm going to talk about some of the key arguments that are going to happen in the debates. And third, I'm going to give you some ideas for helping to win your debates on this topic, which I think has really good arguments on both sides. So let's start with the topic. Global economic integration is on balance unjust. Well, what does it mean when we say global economic integration? What is that going to mean in your debates? Well, according to Investopedia, economic integration is an economic arrangement between different regions marked by the reduction or elimination of trade barriers and the coordination of monetary and fiscal policies. Let's unpack that so we understand that. Right now, when countries say Canada and Korea or the United States and Germany trade with each other, there are typically regulations on what gets traded, and there are also taxes on the trade, sometimes called tariffs. And when those tariffs becomes very high, or when the regulations make it difficult to exchange those goods, they're oftentimes called trade barriers. And the idea with economic integration is to make it so that the regulations and the tariffs, the trade taxes, are low and don't put up barriers to the exchange of goods between countries. You've probably heard of NAFTA, which involves Canada, the United States, and Mexico. That was an economic integration between among those three countries, which reduced the trade barriers and it reduced the regulation so that the countries could sell their goods to each other and open up a big marketplace there. So that's the idea behind economic integration. Low taxes, low regulations among countries so they can exchange goods with each other. Another sense of economic integration is that last part of the definition about coordinating monetary and fiscal policies, and that coordination allows those countries to operate under the same set of rules. Have you heard of Brexit? That's the recent British United Kingdom decision to leave the European Union. The European Union is a group of countries in Europe that agreed to coordinate their monetary and fiscal policies and get rid of almost all trade barriers among the countries so they would all share one standard and follow the same economic policies. Well, some of the British people weren't very happy with that, and so the United Kingdom, which includes Scotland, Ireland, and Britain, voted to leave the European Union. In other words, to reduce their economic integration. That decision has spurred a lot of controversy, and Britain's economy isn't doing so well as a result of that, because now countries trying to trade with Britain will have to follow an entirely different set of rules than they follow for the rest of the European Union. In fact, it's so bad that Scotland and Ireland, which are currently, along with Britain, part of the United Kingdom, both Ireland and Scotland have stated that their intention is to leave the United Kingdom so that they can continue to be part of the European Union. So that's just one example of how that the European Union has created a controversy over that economic integration. Another example of this is how the EU, the European Union, has dealt with Greece and Spain and some other countries that have large amounts of debt. The European Union has demanded that these countries that are part of the European Union cut back on their social spending and really tighten up their monetary and fiscal policies And the Greece people and the Spanish people aren't very happy about that because it's cut social spending to them. It's put less money into their economies, and their economies are doing poorly, very high unemployment. So they're not very happy with the economic integration. The other side of that is that without the economic integration, those countries might wind up like Britain has, where it's really hurt their economy to leave the European Union. And that all shows you kind of what economic integration is and some of the problems involved in it. So what arguments are going to pop up in your debates? Well, I'm going to list out a number of arguments that you should be thinking about, preparing arguments for in your cases, and definitely in your rebuttals against pro and con cases. One of the arguments has to do with intellectual property rights. Intellectual property rights guarantee that if you own something, you will earn the profit from it. And when you have intellectual property rights, you usually want other countries to follow and adhere to them, so they're often part of economic integration. In other words, they'll have a trade agreement, and as part of that, they'll agree to abide by the intellectual property rights. And you know, when you own something, you want to earn money from it because you've invested in it and you put time into it. But there are some downsides to it. One downside is in the drug industry, where companies that own intellectual property rights charge extremely high prices for their drugs. And in fact, in some cases, say for example, drugs for HIV, the people cannot afford them. And so a number of people have criticized this part of economic integration, arguing that intellectual property rights is bad, that it ought to be loosened up, and that it's unjust currently because it leaves people without access to drugs, which kills people, leaves people ill, and also threatens diseases that would spread because the drugs aren't affordable to treat it. Another area where the intellectual property rights pops up is in controlling plants, animals, and DNA even from indigenous people, people that live in local areas, and those people have used those plants and DNA and animals for years and years, never thinking that they needed to have like a copyright stamp on it for intellectual property rights. And a large multinational corporation will come in and claim the intellectual property rights, and then the indigenous people not only have lost the right to access those plants, animals, etc., they may very well have to pay the multinational company to use those things that they've used for hundreds of years. That's created some real serious problems that have left some indigenous communities in real trouble. So that's another area of argument about economic integration being possibly unjust. On a different level, more of an economic level, there are arguments both sides about economic integration increasing the rich-poor gap, economic inequality, and also reducing economic inequality. In terms of increasing it, many people see the new trade rules and globalism of capitalism and exchange of goods as just pumping more and more money into large multinational corporations, abusing workers and leaving some people who had jobs in an industry without any employment because they've all moved to another country where they pay the workers much less. The other side of that is when you open up trade, it allows people now to get access to sell their goods, and now workers have more jobs in those areas, and oftentimes that's in some of the poorer areas in the world, particularly Asia has done very well in reducing the rich-poor gap via trade. Another aspect to this is that that sometimes big countries that are very wealthy They have good lawyers. They have more access and influence in world organizations, and they sometimes abuse the smaller countries in these trade economic integration agreements. And so there's been some concern about that. The other side of that is that some of the small countries can use the rules of the World Trade Organizations to help them fight against abuse by the big countries. And that kind of leads to, you need to know about the World Trade Organization. That's an organization of many, many countries on our earth that have agreed to reduce tariff barriers, to reduce taxes and regulations, to have more equitable trade. It certainly has not achieved that objective completely, but somewhat. And when disputes happen, there are mechanisms in the World Trade Organization to address disputes. It's worked somewhat. In other ways, it has not worked as well as it should. That leads into the next kind of argument that may be brought up, and that has to do with the World Trade Organization and other trade agreements aren't necessarily democratic, and they tend to give too much control to corporations and elites, high-powered individuals, rather than giving the workers and the people more of a say in what happens in the trade of goods. So you're going to have some debates about whether economic integration is democratic, giving workers and people a say in the exchange of their goods, versus it all winding up in the hands of corporations and technocrats and bureaucrats at the World Trade Organization. You're definitely going to want to be ready for arguments about Brexit. Even though Brexit is about leaving the European Union, which isn't necessarily global economic integration, it is part of global economic integration to have an entire set of countries join together and have unified economic policies. And it's a good example of what happens if you support economic integration or you're against it. So you should be ready for arguments about Brexit. And of course, as part of that, you need to look at the economic effects. Some of the people argue that if we could reduce trade barriers and have more equitable trade structures, you could reduce poverty throughout the world by over 300 million individuals. And that happens because more people have access to jobs sending out products, services, and goods, foods, etc., because there aren't those tariffs that stop them from selling it. And another aspect of it is that when all those countries start trading with each other, it's just more economic growth, and that helps people. The other side of it is that the economic benefits tend to go to corporations and wealthy individuals, and in some cases, the economic effect hurts people because there are less and less jobs available because some other country or it got automated in another nation, and so the jobs are lost, and that hurts people. Another area that's going to pop up is worker safety issues, where companies try to take their manufacturing or whatever work they do to another country that doesn't have good worker safety efforts, and then workers get hurt, they're physically injured, maybe psychologically injured. That can be a real problem. Part of that too can be the health of the workers, maybe inhaling toxins in the workplace or working with materials without any gloves or protective gear, and they become endangered. I mean, this is a big issue in agriculture with pesticides and toxins that are used that can really affect the farm workers. And then that kind of leads into the environmental consequences. So you've got people that are working for these companies, and some of them are dumping even toxic waste into the lands, pollution into the air, pollution, sludge, horrible chemicals into the water. And that can be a real problem when you free up trade and you allow companies to go to locations where they don't have strong regulations to stop that. The final kind of argument that you definitely should be ready for is war and conflict. There's a lot of empirical evidence, and it goes both ways, about economic ties increasing tensions among countries, and then also typically that it reduces tensions, because you don't want to go to war with the country you want to purchase your goods, and so it's reduced the tendency to go to war. And all of those are arguments that you're going to be hearing in your debates, and they may get very specific. I mean, they may really go after a drug for treating malaria, for example. Or they might look at environmental consequences and talk about toxic waste from dump grounds transferred over to other countries. So there's quite a bit to be prepared for on this topic. It's pretty broad, but the good thing is there's lots of evidence on both sides, and it allows you to have a really good debate. So who's going to win the debates? I have two main suggestions beyond just being prepared with a solid case and rebuttals to the arguments, which are always needed. Number one, have a framework in your case so that you explain what the most important issue is. The fact is, your opponents are going to be able to point out good or bad things to economic integration. And you'll, of course, respond to those. Use good rebuttal skills and arguments. But the truth is, at the end of the day, the end of the debate, there's going to be some benefits and some harms to economic integration. The key thing is to pick the most important issue. It might be economic growth. It might be the rich-poor gap. It might be environmental consequences. It might be indigenous people. And lay out in your framework why that's the most important thing, so that you, in those summary and final focus speeches, can say, look, we won this issue, and they're most important because they connect to our framework, showing that, for example, protecting the environment is the most important thing. In fact, it's so important, even if there are some economic harms, it's still more important to protect the environment. So I think that's really important to develop that impact analysis there. And then I think the second thing that's really important in these debates is to just really emphasize and impact all of the arguments that you present in each of your speeches. So don't just leave it, I'm sorry, I'm still talking about the impact part. This is not the second point, sorry. In each of the arguments in your cases and even your rebuttals, impact and explain the importance of those arguments so that it can help you build your framework and explain why it's more important. Here's the second way that I think is really important for winning these debates. Have at least one fully developed, probably 2 or 3 quotations, several reasons, examples in your case that's unique and that will throw the other team off. So, for example, you might talk about trade of agriculture. And, agriculture, it's really important for African nations to be able to trade and sell their agricultural products, no doubt about that. That can be a core part of what you argue in the debate, is that developing indigenous agriculture is really critical, and maybe even talk about how that's critical specifically for some countries. Narrow it down in this particular instance to the agriculture aspect, and that might lead the other team to not be ready to respond to it. Another angle, I haven't talked about it, but it could be, for example, the sale of technological goods. And you could say that economic integration is leading countries to sell very high level, highly capable technology that's being used to develop new kinds of weapons that threaten other areas and are used to threaten people. Develop that specific point, and then the other side may not have good responses to that because they just didn't think about that specific thing. So I strongly encourage you to pick something kind of unique at least for one of your points in your cases, develop it, explain why it's important, how it's a critical part of trade. And I think that, coupled with weighing the arguments through your framework, will put you ahead in your debates. And with that, I hope you've got a better sense about what global economic integration is, what some of the arguments are, and how to win your debates. And I hope you have a great time debating this topic as you move on towards your tournament. Thanks, folks.